Millions of people turned on their computer this month and got hit with the same message. Your operating system is no longer supported. No more security patches, no more fixes, nothing. Microsoft has officially walked away from Windows 10, and the fallout is bigger than anyone expected. Because while everyone assumed users would just upgrade to Windows 11, a huge number of them didn't. They left. And where they went should worry Microsoft a lot more than a bad quarterly earnings call. This is the story of the quiet exodus Microsoft didn't see coming. How it happened, why it happened now, and why this time might actually be different from every other year of the Linux desktop joke you've heard for the last 20 years. Let's start with the deadline itself, because the timing here matters more than people realize. Windows 10 support officially ended on October 14th, 2025. For most of the past decade, end-of-support deadlines like this came and went without much drama. Microsoft would nag you for a few months, you'd click Remind Me Later for the 100th time, and life went on. Windows XP support ended in 2014, and plenty of machines just kept running it anyway. Windows 7 support ended in 2020, and the world barely noticed. This time was different for one simple reason: hardware. Windows 11 requires a TPM 2.0 security chip and a fairly modern processor, and that requirement quietly locked out an enormous number of machines that were, in every practical sense, still perfectly good computers. We're talking about laptops from 2016, 2017, 2018. Machines that still play games, still edit documents, still browse the web just fine. Microsoft told their owners those computers were now too old to be trusted with security updates, so people were left staring at three options. Option 1, pay Microsoft for extended security updates, essentially a subscription fee just to keep receiving patches on an operating system you already own. Option 2, throw out a working computer and buy a brand new one, purely because Microsoft moved the goalposts. Option 3, try something else entirely. A lot of people chose option 3, and that's where this story actually starts. Here's where the numbers get genuinely interesting, because this isn't a vibes-based claim. It's tracked, measured, and documented. StatCounter, the analytics firm that tracks operating system usage across billions of web page views, showed Linux's share of the global desktop market climbing from under 3% back in 2022 to nearly 4.7% by the end of 2025. That's roughly a 70% relative increase in just 3 years. And for the first time in the platform's history, the United States crossed the 5% threshold on its own in mid-2025. Now, on paper, that might sound small. It isn't. Desktop computing has been Windows territory for over 30 years. Linux has been about to break through every single year since roughly 2005, and it never did until this stretch. A 70% relative jump, landing almost perfectly on top of the Windows 10 shutdown, is not a coincidence. It's cause and effect, playing out in real time. And it's not just casual browsing statistics either. One of the more beginner-friendly Linux distributions, Zorin OS, reported that more than 780,000 people specifically migrated away from Windows after the end-of-life announcement went public. Not 780,000 downloads. 780,000 people who made the decision, did the install, and left Windows behind. Analysts tracking the trend now project Linux could reach roughly 6% of the global desktop market by the end of this year, if the current trajectory holds. Governments are getting in on it too, and this is the part that should really make Microsoft nervous, because governments don't move fast unless something forces them to. Germany has been migrating tens of thousands of official government computers away from Microsoft software entirely, replacing Windows and Office with Linux and LibreOffice. Denmark launched a similar initiative. Switzerland went even further, committing hundreds of millions of dollars to build a national cloud service and passing legislation that requires government-developed software to be released as open source by default. This isn't a handful of hobbyists arguing on a forum anymore. This is public institutions spending public money, deliberately walking away from the world's biggest software company. So why now? Why did this particular deadline succeed where every other the year of Linux prediction failed for 2 decades? It comes down to 3 forces hitting at exactly the same time. And it's worth breaking each one down individually because they reinforce each other. The first is forced obsolescence, and this is an emotional trigger as much as a technical one. People are genuinely furious that a computer that was working perfectly fine suddenly became unsupported, not because anything broke, not because the hardware failed, but because Microsoft, sitting in a boardroom, decided it did. That's a very different kind of frustration than a slow product decline. It feels like being told your car is suddenly illegal to drive, even though nothing about the car changed. When people feel like a decision was made against them rather than for them, they don't just grumble. They look for the exit. The second force is what you could call the upgrade tax. Extended security updates aren't free forever, and plenty of users have made it very clear, loudly, across forums and social media, that they are not willing to pay Microsoft an ongoing subscription fee just to keep doing exactly what they were already doing yesterday. There's something particularly grating about a company charging you extra just to maintain the status quo. It doesn't feel like a new feature. It feels like a toll booth that appeared on a road you've been driving for free for a decade. The third force is the one almost nobody predicted a few years ago. Gaming finally works on Linux. This is arguably the single biggest shift in the entire story, because gaming has always been Linux's Achilles heel. For 20 years, the standard advice was, Linux is great, except you can't game on it. That's no longer true. Valve's Proton compatibility layer, combined with the runaway success of the Steam Deck, has made Linux gaming genuinely viable, not as a compromise, but as a real alternative. Steam's own hardware survey has shown Linux gaming share spiking past 5% at multiple points over the past year, numbers that would have sounded like a typo 5 years ago. When gamers, historically one of the most Windows-loyal groups on the planet, start treating Linux as a legitimate option, that's a signal the entire industry pays attention to. Put those three forces together, forced obsolescence, the upgrade tax, and gaming finally working, and you get exactly what we're watching happen right now. A large group of people who felt pushed out the door by Microsoft, landing on an operating system that, for the first time, doesn't feel like a downgrade when they get there. It's worth pausing here to talk about which distributions are actually absorbing all these new users, because Linux isn't one single thing, it's an entire ecosystem. And the beginner-friendly corner of that ecosystem has clearly been preparing for this exact moment. Linux Mint has spent years building a reputation as the most Windows-like Linux experience available, with a familiar taskbar, a familiar start menu, and none of the intimidating terminal-first reputation Linux used to have. Zorin OS, as mentioned earlier, built its entire pitch around mimicking the Windows layout so closely that switchers barely have to relearn anything. Pop. OS has carved out a strong niche with gamers and creators thanks to excellent hardware support. And on the gaming side specifically, SteamOS and Steam Deck style distributions like Bazite have shown an entire generation of gamers what a Linux-based system looks like without ever using the word Linux in the marketing. It's worth pointing out how differently this generation of Linux distributions is being designed compared to a decade ago, because the shift in philosophy is just as important as the shift in numbers. Older Linux distributions were largely built by developers, for developers, with the assumption that anyone installing it already understood how computers worked under the hood. Documentation assumed command line comfort. Troubleshooting forums assumed you already knew what a kernel module was. That approach kept the user base small and self-selecting for years. The current wave of beginner-focused distributions flipped that assumption entirely. They're designed from the ground up for someone who has never opened a terminal in their life and never plans. 2. Automatic updates happen quietly in the background instead of requiring manual commands. Driver support for printers, webcams, and Wi-Fi adapters now works out of the box for the overwhelming majority of common hardware. Software installation happens through an App Store-style interface that looks and feels almost identical to what Windows or Mac users already expect. None of that existed in any polished form 10 years ago. And its absence back then is a big part of why earlier predictions of a Linux breakthrough kept failing to materialize. Let's talk for a second about what this actually looks like on the ground, because statistics only tell half the story. Picture a fairly ordinary household setup. A 5 or 6-year-old laptop, still perfectly capable of handling email, browsers, spreadsheets, maybe some light photo editing. That machine gets the Windows 11 compatibility check, fails it, and now the owner is staring at a decision that has nothing to do with technology and everything to do with money and principle. Buying a new laptop just to keep doing the same tasks feels wasteful to a lot of people, especially with the cost of everything else going up. So instead, more and more of them are searching things like how to install Linux for the very first time in their lives, watching a tutorial, and discovering that the process today takes maybe 20 minutes and doesn't require touching a single line of code. That 20-minute experience matters enormously because it's the exact opposite of what Linux used to require. A decade ago, installing Linux meant partitioning drives manually, hunting down the right drivers, and accepting that half your peripherals might not work out of the box. Today, distributions built specifically for switchers walk you through the entire process with the same kind of guided installer Windows itself uses. The technical barrier that used to scare off casual users has largely disappeared, which means the only thing left standing between a frustrated Windows user and a full switch is awareness that the option even exists. And that awareness is exactly what's spreading right now. One YouTube video, one forum thread, one coworker recommendation at a time. There's also a privacy angle running underneath all of this that doesn't get talked about enough. A lot of switchers aren't just leaving because of the hardware requirement. They're leaving because Windows 11 has leaned harder into telemetry, account requirements, bundled advertising in the Start menu, and AI features that constantly scan and summarize what's on your screen. For a certain kind of user, the hardware lockout was simply the final straw on top of years of frustration with an operating system that increasingly feels like it's working for Microsoft's data collection goals first and the user's convenience second. Linux, by contrast, doesn't require a Microsoft account to log in, doesn't insert ads into your file explorer, and doesn't phone home nearly as aggressively. For privacy-conscious users, that difference alone is worth the 20-minute learning curve. It's also worth debunking a couple of myths that used to be completely fair criticisms of Linux, but increasingly aren't anymore. The old line was always, "Sure, but none of my software will work." That's far less true today than it's ever been. Web-based versions of Office, Google Workspace, and most major productivity tools run identically in a browser, regardless of what operating system is underneath it. Valve's Proton layer has made a huge percentage of the Windows gaming library playable without any extra effort, to the point where entire databases exist ranking which games run flawlessly. And for the specific handful of Windows-only programs that still don't have a direct equivalent, compatibility tools have closed enough of the gap that most casual users never actually run into a wall. The software excuse, which used to be Linux's biggest weakness, has quietly stopped being the deal breaker it once was for the average person. Now let's talk about how Microsoft has responded to all of this, because the response, or more accurately the lack of one, tells its own story. Microsoft's public messaging since the Windows 10 shutdown has stayed almost entirely focused on Windows 11 adoption numbers, how many devices have upgraded, how AI features like Copilot are being baked deeper into the operating system, how cloud integration keeps expanding. What you will not find is any public acknowledgement that a meaningful chunk of the user base didn't upgrade to Windows 11 at all. They left the ecosystem entirely. That silence is telling. When a company has a good story to tell, it tells it loudly, with a press release and a keynote slide. When a company goes quiet about something, it's usually because the honest version of that story doesn't help them. Microsoft has every incentive to frame this transition as a clean, successful migration to Windows 11. Talking publicly about hundreds of thousands of users defecting to Linux instead doesn't fit that narrative, so it simply doesn't get mentioned. It's also worth putting this moment in historical context, because Linux desktop adoption has a long, difficult history of promises that never quite delivered. Back in the early 2000s, the city of Munich, Germany, famously attempted a massive migration away from Windows to a custom Linux distribution called Linux, saving money and gaining independence from a single vendor. It took years, ran into real compatibility headaches, and eventually, after a change in city government, Munich, controversially, moved back to Windows. For a long time, that story got used as the go-to example of, see, even governments can't make Linux work long-term. But the landscape today is genuinely different from the Munich experiment 2 decades ago in ways that matter. Web-based software has replaced a huge portion of what used to require Windows-specific desktop applications, which massively lowers the compatibility barrier that killed a lot of earlier migration attempts. Gaming, as we've covered, has gone from basically impossible to genuinely competitive. And critically, this current wave isn't being driven top-down by a government mandate. It's being driven bottom-up by frustrated individual users making their own decision, one household at a time. Bottom-up movements tend to be stickier than top-down mandates because nobody has to convince these people to switch. They already decided to switch on their own. Let's zoom back out to the enterprise and government side for a moment, because it's easy to assume that only budget-conscious households are making this move, and that's not the full picture. Enterprise IT departments have their own version of the same math playing out. Every machine that fails the Windows 11 hardware check is a machine that either needs replacing at company expense or needs an alternative operating system deployed instead, and for organizations managing thousands of desktops, that cost difference isn't small change. It's a line item that finance departments notice. Add in growing concerns among IT administrators about vendor lock-in, rising licensing costs, and increased AI-driven data collection built directly into the operating system, and Linux starts looking less like a hobbyist choice and more like a legitimate cost control and data sovereignty strategy. That's exactly the calculation Germany, Denmark, and Switzerland appear to have made at a national level, and smaller organizations are quietly running the same numbers on a smaller scale. There's also a knock-on effect worth mentioning: developer usage. Independent surveys of software developers have consistently shown Linux as either the primary or secondary operating system for a majority of respondents, and that number has only grown. When the people actually building the software the rest of us use are increasingly working in Linux environments day to day, that shapes what gets built, what gets tested well, and what compatibility gets prioritized going forward. A growing developer base isn't just a side statistic, it's a leading indicator because software ecosystems tend to follow wherever the builders already are. So where does this actually leave things? Let's be honest about the scale here, because overstating it would be dishonest. Linux still isn't anywhere close to catching Windows. Windows still commands roughly 2/3 of the global desktop market, and that is not about to flip anytime soon. Nobody serious is claiming Linux is about to become the dominant desktop operating system next year, or even in 5 years. But market share alone isn't the only thing worth paying attention to here. What actually matters is the direction of movement and the reason behind it. For the first time in over a decade, a large, motivated wave of ordinary users, not developers, not long-time open, source enthusiasts, not the usual early adopter crowd, left Windows specifically because of a decision Microsoft made. Not because Linux ran an aggressive marketing campaign, not because of a viral ad, because Microsoft told them their working computer was suddenly obsolete, and they decided they'd rather leave than comply. That's a fundamentally different kind of growth than anything the Linux desktop has experienced before, and it's the kind of growth that tends to compound. Every one of those new users becomes a data point other frustrated Windows users see online. A friend, a coworker, a forum post, a YouTube comment saying, "I switched and it's fine, actually." Word of mouth from people who genuinely didn't want to switch but did anyway and found it painless is far more persuasive than any amount of traditional advertising could ever be. And if even a fraction of that projected 6% by the end of this year actually materializes, this stops being a niche story that tech YouTubers talk about and starts being a business problem Microsoft's board actually has to address. Because once market share numbers move enough to threaten advertising revenue, developer attention, and enterprise contracts, silence stops being a viable strategy. So here's the real question. This whole story boils down to, it isn't really about whether Linux won anything, because that framing misses the point entirely. The real question is whether Microsoft just handed millions of loyal, longtime Windows users an actual reason to leave, at the exact moment an alternative finally became good enough to catch them when they did. 20 years of maybe next year for Linux jokes, and the thing that finally moved the needle wasn't a brilliant new Linux feature. It was Microsoft itself drawing a hardware line in the sand and daring people to cross it. A lot of them crossed it. And it's worth thinking about where this trend goes from here, because none of the underlying forces we've talked about today are going away. Windows 10 machines aren't getting any newer. Every month that passes is another month. Those unsupported systems fall further behind on security, pushing more of their owners toward a decision they've been putting off. Windows 11's hardware requirements aren't getting relaxed either. If anything, each new feature Microsoft ships leans harder into requiring newer silicon, which keeps widening the pool of machines that qualify as obsolete in Microsoft's eyes, even though they still work perfectly fine in reality. And Linux gaming compatibility keeps improving every single month as Valve continues refining Proton, which means the single biggest historical objection to switching keeps getting weaker, not stronger. If those trends hold, and there's no obvious reason they'd reverse, then the 6% projection for this year might end up looking conservative rather than optimistic by the time next year's numbers come in. And every percentage point passed, that starts to matter, more than the last one, because desktop market share isn't a smooth curve, it's a series of tipping points. Once enough ordinary, non-technical people have successfully made the switch and told their friends about it, the remaining psychological barrier, the idea that Linux is scary or complicated collapses a lot faster than the adoption numbers before it ever did. If you're one of the people who made that jump, or if you're still sitting on an unsupported Windows 10 machine right now weighing your options, I genuinely want to hear about it in the comments below. What finally pushed you to try it? Or what's still holding you back? And if you want to see exactly how brutal the Windows 11 hardware requirements really are, and which specific machines got locked out for no good technical reason, I've got an entire video breaking that down, linked right here. Subscribe if you don't want to miss what Microsoft does next, because based on everything we've covered today,